Welcome to the Daily Globe. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon for more breaking updates. In a landmark decision, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down tariffs enacted by former President Trump, redefining presidential authority and impacting millions of Americans. The ruling closes a contentious chapter in American economic policy, built on a controversial interpretation of emergency powers. This decision signals a potential return to a more predictable, rules-based trading system, affecting global trade and diplomacy. The tariffs, often seen as a tax on consumers, contributed to rising prices on numerous products. The court's ruling opens the door to refunding billions of dollars, challenging the federal government and affecting the national budget. As we stand at this critical juncture, today marks a turning point in trade policy and presidential power. This story explores the origins, legal battles, and fallout of this landmark decision. The Trump administration's tariff strategy was a cornerstone of its America First agenda, signaling a bold shift in how the United States approached global trade. Rather than relying on traditional diplomatic channels or multilateral agreements, the administration sought to use economic pressure as a primary tool of foreign policy. Central to this approach was the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, a law originally designed to give the president authority to act swiftly in times of national emergency, especially when dealing with threats from abroad. By invoking IEPA, the administration was able to bypass Congress and act unilaterally. This law, intended for sanctions against hostile nations, was controversially used to impose sweeping tariffs, affecting nearly every major U.S. trading partner, from China and the European Union to Canada and Mexico. The tariffs were not just about economics, they were a negotiating tactic, a way to force other countries to the bargaining table and demand policy changes. This marked a sharp departure from decades of U.S. trade policy, which had long favored free trade and open markets. The scale of these tariffs was unprecedented, targeting hundreds of billions of dollars in imports. Everything from raw materials like steel and aluminum to finished goods such as electronics and consumer products was affected, sending shockwaves through global supply chains. Critics, including lawmakers from both parties and business leaders, argued this was a dangerous overreach of presidential power. They warned that transforming an emergency statute into a tool for economic protectionism set a troubling precedent and risked undermining the checks and balances at the heart of American democracy. The legal battle over this interpretation of IEPA soon escalated, laying the groundwork for a historic Supreme Court showdown that would test the limits of executive authority. The administration's actions were widely seen as bypassing Congress's constitutional role in levying taxes and regulating commerce, raising fundamental questions about the separation of powers. This fundamental disagreement over the boundaries of presidential and congressional authority led to a fierce legal battle, one that would ultimately reach the highest court in the land. The tariffs were presented by the administration as a powerful negotiating lever, a way to force other countries to change their economic policies and address what they saw as unfair trade practices. This aggressive approach marked a dramatic break from the past, upending decades of U.S. trade policy that had generally favored free trade, multinational agreements, and international cooperation. The story of this ruling is not confined to the borders of the United States. Its impact rippled across the globe, affecting international markets, foreign governments, and the very nature of global trade itself. The legal challenge against the tariffs sparked a years-long battle through the federal court system. Plaintiffs, a coalition of businesses, argued the president acted outside his constitutional authority, imposing a tax hike without Congress's consent. The government's lawyers defended the tariffs as a legitimate use of IEPA, citing national security threats. The case became a focal point for a larger debate about executive power, with legal scholars and economists weighing in. Opponents warned that allowing a president to use an emergency law to set tax policy would create a dangerous precedent. The Supreme Court was asked to resolve whether IEPA empowered the president to impose taxes under national security. The Supreme Court's hearing on the tariffs was a pivotal moment, questioning the executive branch's emergency power claims. This case had the potential to redefine the balance of power between the branches of government, making it a landmark moment in legal history. Lawyers argued the administration stretched IEPA beyond its purpose, bypassing established trade laws. They contended that such actions undermined the legislative framework designed to regulate international trade. Justices questioned the limitless nature of the government's argument, concerned about future presidential overreach. They probed the implications of allowing such broad executive authority without sufficient checks and balances. Justice Sotomayor highlighted that tariffs are taxes paid by the American people. She emphasized the real-world impact on consumers and businesses, questioning the fairness of such measures. The government's defense of tariffs as a national security tool faced skepticism. Justices were wary of the precedent this could set for future administrations. The U.S. Treasury had collected over $100 billion from these tariffs, with potential refund liabilities looming large. This financial burden added another layer of complexity to the case. The hearing suggested the administration was on shaky legal ground. The justices' pointed questions indicated their doubts about the legality of the tariffs. The justices were not just deciding a point of law, they were contemplating a decision with profound financial consequences. Their ruling could reshape the economic landscape and affect international relations. The prospect of repaying such a colossal sum loomed large over the proceedings. The financial stakes were immense, adding pressure to the justices' deliberations. The justices were not just deciding a point of law, they were contemplating a decision with profound and immediate financial consequences for the nation. Their ruling would have a lasting impact on the country's economic policies and legal precedents. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the Trump administration overstepped its authority using IEEPA for tariffs. The decision affirmed Congress's constitutional power to levy taxes, declaring the tariffs unconstitutional. The U.S. Treasury must refund over $100 billion, creating a financial challenge for the government. Businesses eligible for refunds celebrate, but consumers who paid higher prices won't see compensation. The ruling has sent shockwaves through Washington and the business community. Political reactions are swift, with former President Trump condemning the ruling. Critics hail the decision as a triumph for the rule of law and a check on executive overreach. The ruling comes at a politically sensitive time, with recent Democratic election victories being attributed to economic concerns among voters. The court's decision adds another layer of complexity to the national political conversation. The decision adds complexity to the political landscape, focusing on the economic legacy of the previous administration. The Supreme Court's decision marks the end of a controversial policy that has left a lasting imprint on the American economy. For years, tariffs have been at the center of heated debates, shaping the way businesses operate and affecting the daily lives of millions of Americans. Tariffs functioned as a tax on consumers, with costs passed down the supply chain, raising prices on goods. Everyday essentials, from groceries to electronics, became more expensive, putting pressure on families and small businesses alike. About half of U.S. imports are intermediate goods, which means that many American manufacturers rely on these imports to produce finished products. As tariffs increased the cost of these materials, production expenses soared, making it harder for U.S. companies to compete globally. Ironically, the policy often harmed the very industrial sector it aimed to help, dragging on economic growth and leading to layoffs or reduced hours in some factories. Many communities dependent on manufacturing felt the brunt of these changes. The economic rationale behind the tariffs faced growing scrutiny. Many economists argued that the U.S. trade deficit is a normal feature of a service-based economy, and that tariffs did little to address underlying issues. In reality, the tariffs were seen by many as a solution to a problem that didn't truly exist, causing economic pain without delivering clear benefits. Businesses struggled to absorb higher costs, and some were forced to pass them on to consumers. The U.S. Consumer Price Index rose steadily, with tariffs contributing to inflation and squeezing household budgets. For many families, this meant making tough choices about spending and saving. Public opinion polls showed a majority opposed the tariffs, sensing their impact on living costs and expressing concern about the direction of economic policy. The court's ruling may provide much-needed financial relief for importers, but the broader economic effects have already been felt by millions of workers, business owners, and consumers across the country. As the dust settles, the economic landscape will begin to shift. Businesses are now preparing to adjust to a post-tariff reality, rethinking supply chains and investment strategies for the future. The Supreme Court's decision is widely seen as a positive development for American businesses and consumers, offering hope for renewed growth and stability in the years ahead. Legal scholars view the Supreme Court decision as a landmark moment for separation of powers. Experts noted IEEPA's weaknesses, lacking specific language for tariffs, and the court embraced this reasoning. The ruling reaffirms Congress's authority over trade and taxation, seen as a positive for businesses and consumers. Economists argue removing tariffs will alleviate inflation and restore predictability to supply chains. The decision checks the imperial presidency, reinforcing checks and balances in governance. Future presidents may need to work more closely with Congress on economic policy. The Supreme Court's ruling redraws presidential power boundaries, pushing back against executive overreach. By rejecting IEEPA's broad interpretation, the court limits presidential actions, even under national security claims. Future presidents must rely on more constrained legislative pathways for major trade policies. The ruling impacts the federal budget, requiring cooperation between the White House and Congress. By reinforcing Congress's power of the purse, the court strengthens legislative oversight. The judiciary's decision reaffirms that the president's powers are not limitless. It emphasizes that monumental economic decisions must flow through Congress. This ruling will be studied as a key moment in the dialogue about presidential power. The Supreme Court's decision overturning tariffs is a watershed moment with far-reaching consequences. It reaffirms Congress's authority to tax and regulate commerce, setting a precedent for future presidents. The immediate outcome is the complex task of refunding over $100 billion to importers. Businesses will receive refunds, but consumers won't see returned costs, highlighting tariff impacts. The economic landscape will shift as businesses adjust to a post-tariff reality. The key question is what comes next for American trade policy and international relations. The decision could signal a return to a stable, predictable trading system. The story continues as decisions in Washington and boardrooms shape the long-term legacy of this historic day.